Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney. I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hi, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yes.
We do apologize for the length of time in between last episode and this one. I'm sure as anybody out there with kids understands that pretty much as soon as it gets cold, everybody gets sick.
Oh, yes. And also, we had the holidays.
We did.
So it was very busy with family and friends and sickness.
Sickness,
So,
Thank goodness for NyQuil.
Yes.
But we are here. We are ready. We are excited.
Yes, we are.
We've been doing a ton of work in the meantime, so we did not, we didn't lose any time being able to get some more research ready for you guys so that we could keep talking about the Titanic.
Oh, yes. So continue on.
But we did want to make a couple comments. During the last episode, it was asked if Titanic was the largest maritime disaster. After further research, it turns out that neither the Titanic nor the Lusitania had the greatest loss of life.
No, what we found out was that the most deadly maritime disaster happened to the German military transport ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was
Bless
sunk.
you.
Oh, thank you. Which was sunk on January 30th, 1945, by a Soviet submarine while evacuating civilian evacuees from East Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Estonia. By one estimate, over 9,000 people died, making it the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking in history.
Amazing.
That is absolutely amazing.
And so we had also looked up, because with Titanic, there's the approximate death toll of 1,500. And then with the Lusitania, she was sunk in 1915, and her approximate death toll was 1,200. Wow. So the Wilhelm Gustloff is more than both of them combined, like times 3.
Yes. There have been a lot of very deadly maritime. When I was looking into it, there was articles where the 10 deadliest. I mean, there's been some very large losses of life, but from what I could find, is the Wilhelm Gustloff was by far one of the worst.
It kind of makes me want to encourage my sister to not go on a cruise for her wedding. But anyway, we'll see how that goes.
It makes me think differently. There's no doubt about it.
Can we go on the website and check out your lifeboat situation real quick?
That's the first thing I'll be looking at.
Right.
So in the previous episode, we said that the Titanic's scheduled arrival date was Tuesday, April 16th, 1912, and that is not correct. The scheduled arrival date was actually Wednesday, April 17th, 1912. However, the general talk amongst the passengers was that Titanic was making such good progress that they could possibly arrive Tuesday night. So there was this scuttlebutt going around that we're doing so well, and I'm not sure which people that would have had those conversations, but there seemed to be. I
actually have quite a few testimonies from people at the last dinner that this was very much the talk, and apparently they would post the days running or the previous days running, and people were talking about it, not just at dinner, but like walking the decks and doing their little promenade and whatnot. So it appeared to be kind of the thing, and I want to say people were maybe even laying bets on the amount of miles. Something's vaguely ringing a bell. So I mean, they're at sea for how many days? So they're all just kind of entertaining themselves how they can.
So there was that mindset of this, getting there sooner. So being the largest, beautiful, fast ship, and
I'm just saying,
a lot
though,
of hype going on.
If I was on this ship and I was getting to eat what they were getting to eat and do nothing but eat and drink and read all day in beautiful surroundings, I would not be counting down
you'd want
to disembarking.
I was going to say, when's ahead? Let's make it Saturday.
You're like, is there daycare on board? Can I put my kid in daycare?
No, that's good. Yeah.
So, but we did also, we had briefly mentioned Titanic's dimensions last time, but before we continue, let's flesh out just how large she really was. So the overall length was 882 feet, 9 inches. And to put that into perspective, a NFL football field, excluding the end zone, is 300 feet. So it would be 3 NFL football fields without end zones.
That is a big ship.
And then her width, a football field is about 160 feet wide, but the distance between the baseball bases are 90 feet, and she was 92 feet 6 inches. So if that can kind of help put that in your mind.
So yeah, something that you've seen that you can see in real life that just help give you an idea of the size.
Yes. And then from the total height from the keel, which is that little fin that sticks down in the water and helps with the stabilization, up to the navigating bridge, which was on the boat deck, was about 100 feet. And the reciprocating engines were capable of 30,000 horsepower.
Wow.
Which, what would that equal today?
Oh, yeah, that is a lot of power.
Okay.
I mean, nothing on the top of my head comes to mind when it comes to what that could be an equivalent to.
What is a car?
Well, I mean, you have these diesel trucks. You're looking at anywhere from that's more like it's more like torque.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I'll have to think about that one.
This is not my forte. Sorry.
That's a lot of power. When you think about the amount of weight and the size, and it could move 22, 23 knots. There's some power there.
Yes. And so the Board of Trade passenger certificate said that Titanic was A-OK to carry 3,547 people. Now, for our voyage, for her maiden voyage, she was only carrying 2,208. So she was actually underloaded for this trip.
That's interesting. I also read that in, I don't know if it was Walter Lord's book. That made me wonder, why were they why did they not have the amount of people? Well, I'm glad they didn't. But
well, I know, right? Considering.
Yeah, here the maiden voyage, and they're undermanned when it came to the passengers. I mean, I guess, has there been any talk of that I
haven't found anything definitive. Like there's definitely, I know that we're going to get into this, but there was the coal strike. But then you would think, anyway, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I do know that there were some people that apparently traveling at sea, it's very superstitious. And so people there's like a bad luck connotation with a maiden voyage. And so, yeah, I guess that there was quite a few people that they went to go purchase their tickets. And then the White Star Line was saying, well, there's Titanic and she's leaving on that day. And people be like, oh, I don't know, it's a maiden voyage. So,
oh man, I'd be thinking, hey, it's brand new. No one slept in that bed, or
I know, right? This is the first go.
My first shuffleboard. I'll be the first one.
Yeah. So, we are all right. So that is kind of an overview and the dimensions, what we're talking about. So, Dad, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's go back in time. Right? Do the Doctor Who theme song. But instead of picking up where we left off in 1912, we are only going to go back to 1955. So.
Why?
Because that was the year that the book A Night to Remember by Walter Lord was published. It was not the first book written about the Titanic, but it was, and arguably still is, the most influential book ever written about the disaster.
And I read that. It is very well written. It's a very easy read, and it was well done.
Yes,
very well done.
It's like, 120 pages?
Yeah, about 150 pages.
And it's written in a narrative style, so you just blow through it, but it's incredible. So Stephen Beale, whose own book focused on the cultural history of Titanic, said it best. He said, in the creation of the Titanic myth, there are two defining moments, 1912, of course, and 1955, referring to the year in which A Night to Remember was published. This shows what an incredible impact this book had on the field of Titanic research. So, Dad, here is a vocabulary word for you.
I like vocabulary words.
Yes, it is historiography.
Oh, wow.
Yes, be a 25-cent word. It is a history, this is my definition.
Okay.
A history of what has been written about a particular topic, an examination of how past and current historians have contributed to the body of knowledge or information about that topic.
Oh, very interesting.
So for us, and really for anybody that's looking into history, a question to keep in mind whenever you're reading, watching, listening to something is, how does this book, article, documentary, podcast contribute to the historiography on the topic? So exploring the historiography of a topic or time period is an essential part of historical research. It involves wrestling with the previous research, not just parroting it. What arguments did the author make? What conclusions did they draw? Were the arguments or conclusions supported by the evidence? Is there any other way to interpret that evidence? In this way, each generation of historian takes a fresh look at the primary sources and contributes their own insights, as well as carrying forward the legacy of those who came before them.
Okay.
So, bearing this process in mind, you can imagine that there are certain perspectives that have been repeated so often that they simply seem set in stone.
Yes. Well, so using historiography in a sentence, so we here at the Primary Nerd are exercising the process of historiography while we're talking about the Titanic. Yeah. I think that works.
Okay, sure. Well, I would say we are going to contribute to the historiography,
Yes, we
and
are.
I'm very excited, but we're not
Yes.
going to get there just yet. So,
Okay. Well, traditionally, the Titanic story is told in a linear fashion, loosely based on time, with the testimonies of the passengers and crew intermingled as the ship moves through the stages of sinking. But there is no denying the logic of this method. The Titanic was literally the largest ship in the world with more than 2,200 people on board, and you have to organize all those testimonies somehow. And being able to mentally map what was happening at the same time on different parts of the ship is incredibly valuable.
however,
However,
we're going to be taking a different approach. I'm really excited about this. It's not very often that you get to kind of leap out into the unknown, but reading through the survivor testimonies has led me in a different direction. I would argue that there's value in separating out the experiences of the two groups of people on the ship, passengers versus crew. Now, by crew, I am including Bruce Ismay as the owner, who was on board, Thomas Andrews as the designer, the officers, and any person employed by the White Star Line and having assigned duties on the Titanic.
okay. So our Titanic episodes will be organized as follows. The experience of the passengers from the day Titanic set sail through the collision and immediately aftermath, up until the point where the passengers who did escape by lifeboat or jumping have left the ship. We will then switch gears and rewind to explore the experiences of the crew members. The time frame will extend from before Titanic set sail up until those members of the crew fortunate enough to escape either by lifeboat or jumping are safely off the ship. So, Courtney, what is the value of organizing the testimonies in this way?
So, if you follow the traditional methodology of intermingling the passenger and the crew testimony to track what was occurring on Titanic minute by minute, which is exactly what Walter Lord does, and most other Titanic historians do the exact same thing. We as the reader are given the benefit of an omniscient narrator zooming us all over the ship to see the most crucial moments at the exact right time, as well as listen in on private conversations between persons that were in the know, if you will, about just how dire the situation really was. We are in all places at once, watching the dominoes fall. This creates a sense of foreboding and urgency in the reader that colors the stories and makes the passenger's actions, or lack thereof in most cases, seem rather foolish. For example, why would the passengers decline to board one of the lifeboats, choosing instead to stay on the ship as she's taking on water? Why would the passengers waiting to board the lifeboats calmly stand by as those boats are lowered at half capacity? Why would the officers and deckhands later justify launching these partially filled boats because there were, quote, no more women on deck to be loaded? But we know that out of the 530 women and children on board Titanic, and that's across all classes, 157 out of 530 lost their lives.
Wow.
And that's according to the U.S. Senate inquiry, their final report. Isn't this taking the British stiff upper lip a little too far? So my initial research had centered around the testimony of the crew that were obtained during the course of the U.S. Senate and the British inquiries. My reasoning being that as employees of the liner, the crew would have insider knowledge that would help explain some of the murkier details of that night. However, reading the accounts of the crew, of the officers and the crew back to back to back, I noticed an unsettling theme. Most of the testimonies reinforced this kind of idealized image of the fearless, stoic passengers willingly accepting their inevitable demise with kind of a better death than dishonor vibe, which I found very odd. It just doesn't jive with what we know about human behavior. People want to live, you know?
Right.
So-
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is a base emotion within
It's
us.
like a core instinct
Oh, yes,
is
core
survival.
Survival, yes.
So after reading through the court testimony, I transitioned into how the passengers described that night in their letters, diaries, memoirs, newspaper statements, etc., and reading their words as the passengers described what they experienced during the most horrifying night of their lives was very emotional. There's no other way to describe it. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't even imagine what they went through. Is just I after all the discussion you and I have had, the book I read, and you bring up a good point, because in Lord's book, there was several people that he's looking at in a linear fashion of different places in the ship. They knew different things were going on, but that wasn't the reality. That wasn't the reality for someone who was down in third class, and that wasn't the reality for somebody who had the mindset of this is a huge unsinkable ship. And let's face it, you're standing in a 900 by 100 by 10-story high, beautiful hotel.
Yes.
And I mean, you have that solid, the solidity of the building around you, and you think, man, how can this sink? And plus all the hype that was that they had given prior to the launch. So, yeah.
And as we're going to talk about, because we haven't even gotten into the passenger testimony, that's where we'll be heading, but they're being told and reassured over and over again from people that are in the know that everything's fine. We are fine. Go back to bed.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't want to get too far down that rabbit trail, but focusing on the individual people that walked Titanic's decks brought a human relatable perspective to the tragedy and illustrated a few overarching themes. Number one, many of the passengers did not know Titanic was sinking.
Wow. Well, I would, yes, after reading Lords, I'm 100% in agreement. They did not know.
No, they did not know.
Yeah.
Which I know that's probably going to sound really simplistic, and some people out there would be like, well, duh. But it's like when you're watching, let's talk about the movie Titanic. Okay, so when they hit the berg and people come out and they're looking and they're playing with the ice, and then almost immediately we get told, that it's fatal, she's going down. And they start loading people into the boats. And yeah, they're saying like, oh, I hope it's not too crowded. But for the most part, people are doing as they're told. They're just kind of cruising along, and there's no kind of point of realization. There's just an increased sense of urgency in how quickly they're moving, in the movie.
Right.
So many of the survivor accounts say that they were not even aware that the ship was sinking until they'd been loaded and lowered in a lifeboat and were floating on the open sea. This surprised me greatly. I had assumed that the passengers were either being advised of the seriousness of the situation or had figured it out for themselves, especially when the lifeboats were being loaded and lowered, or if not at that point, when the water began to come up through the decks and eventually cover the bow of the ship. However, this refusal to believe their own eyes begins to make sense if you consider the next point. Number two, many of the passengers truly believed the Titanic could only sink to a certain level and would go under no further.
Wow.
So remember what we were discussing our last episode? In response to the rumors circulating on April the 15th that the Titanic had sunk just hours before, the vice president of the White Star Line made a statement that even if an accident had occurred, Titanic could remain afloat for 2 to 3 days.
Wow, yes. There definitely was some misinformation when by the time the Titanic, what had happened on Sunday, it was Monday morning?
Sunday night to Monday morning.
Monday morning. And they were supposed to have arrived Wednesday, but yet by the time they didn't even get in till Thursday, there was no information. And so what was being said by the White Star Line or anyone that would put things out is just fake news, basically.
I was putting a Band-Aid on.
Yeah, I mean,
that's for sure.
They really didn't know. So, yeah, but that just kind of goes right in hand with the unsinkability, or it's perceived as virtually unsinkable when you're saying that, I can only go down so far.
Exactly.
And don't worry about it.
Right. So So that, as Walter Lord said in his 1978 book, The Night Lives On, which is a follow-up to A Night to Remember, it's a very good book, he says, quote, "The unsinkability of the Titanic was not the product of some slick advertising copywriter, nor was it a myth later invented to improve the story. It was the considered opinion of experts at the time, and it worked its greatest mischief neither before nor after the event, but during the hours of agonizing uncertainty while the tragedy was still unfolding."
Wow.
And though, with all things, it's dangerous to speak in absolutes, it's important to note that some of the passengers took the collision very seriously from the get-go and had absolutely no doubt in their mind that Titanic was capable of fatally sinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just. But I think about the people that didn't want to get in the lifeboat, and some of the things I read in Lord's book, they're saying, "Why would I want to leave this ship and go float in a little?"
Oh, they were
little
terrified.
dinghy?
They were terrified of the lifeboats.
Yeah. So there definitely was a mindset. There was a definite mindset from some of the passengers about the unsinkability, or could only sink so far.
Right.
That type of thing that definitely played into the way that affected how they acted or their actions that night.
Absolutely. So for this episode, and probably the next one or the next two or three, depending, to truly gain an understanding of what the passengers survived that night, we are going to step into their shoes and experience this tragedy as closely as we can. We will discuss what the passengers saw and heard, what they were told and when, and how this affected the decisions that they made in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. And we will not be overlaying it with what the officers or the crew knew or what they saw. Remember, we're going to just do the passengers first, and then we're going to back it on up, and then we will talk about it from the crew perspective, because we're kind of working our way up from the people with the least amount of knowledge as we're going to move up into greater levels of knowledge.
Okay. No, I can see the value in that, because then we can see what the passengers were thinking. And from their testimony, and this is coming from their testimonies, correct? When we're talking about them, when you mentioned about the 2 points of many of the passengers did not know it was sinking, and that they didn't believe it could only sink to a certain level. This is coming from the testimonies.
Yes.
Okay.
Now those are my words, but it is derived from all of I have read so much. And it's the letters that were written literally on the Carpathia, and the immediately aftermath when they land in New York. It's them expressing to their mothers and fathers and parents-in-law and children what had happened, and they're trying. You can see them trying so hard to get everything down, but then also trying to understand it for themselves. There's a real grappling with, what did I just live through? Right. And so reading through that, it's very gritty. It's definitely grieving.
Oh, yes.
And there's a lot of information, but those are two very large themes that come out.
Oh yeah, because they're they lost loved ones. They're grieving. They're trying to understand, process what happened. So yes, that would be a very, very difficult. Grief is a very difficult thing to go through. So I can't even imagine what they must have gone through that night. So where we left off last episode was, while the White Star Line may not have been explicitly advertising that the Titanic or any of the other White Star Line liners were actually unsinkable, there was a prevailing belief that modern ships were impervious to disaster. So this attitude came from leaders in the industry and was communicated as fact to the public. It was not merely one or two publications that people may or may not have read. This was pervasive. It was out there. So it was definitely a mindset that was there in society. As we had mentioned, the Titanic had captured worldwide attention and excitement as newspapers continued to report on her progress and count down to the days of her maiden voyage. And just 5 days before she set sail, a London newspaper, The Standard, made this prediction, quote, "To the battle of transatlantic passenger service, the Titanic adds a new and important factor. In the fight during the coming season, there will be a scent of battle all the way from New York to the shores of this country, a contest of sea giants in which the Titanic will doubtless take high honors."
I mean, that's a big statement to make.
That is.
Those are warning shots to the
And
Cunard Line and anybody. Them's fighting words.
So the timing of Titanic's maiden voyage was fortuitous, as in the United States, The upcoming summer months meant the beginning of the East Coast's social season for those in the upper classes.
Pictured like debutante balls and teas and
Yeah, that's yeah. I know about it.
mm-hmm.
I don't know much of the particulars, but yes, I
like the picture the Gilded Age. There's a show called The Gilded Age, and I guess I want to say that the first Mrs. Astor had like her 400, that she would only ever invite 400 people, period, to her big fancy balls. And you
Wow.
really wanted to be on that list.
So then, liken that to the coming out or the debutante in England. There, you would have been presented to the Queen, right? So here, it was more some of the
Society.
the high class families or upper class families.
I mean, you and Mom are watching through Gilmore Girls.
Yeah. Well, when they came out,
Rory has her little.
Yeah, well, they were like in a rec center or something.
I don't think they're in a rec center.
But they were in folding chairs, sitting in folding chairs.
Okay, but you know what I'm talking about.
Okay. So, yeah, so the social season, I know something of it, yes. And this meant that many wealthy Americans who had been vacationing in Europe or Africa during the winter months were starting to make their way back home. So some, like Margaret Brown, boarded the Titanic because she was the Titanic was the first available ocean liner heading to New York. Others, like Dickinson and Helen Bishop, deliberately delayed their departure to America so that they could experience Titanic for themselves. Helen Bishop said, "We could have sailed earlier, but waited at Cherbourg to come across on this monster new passenger boat, which was the largest and most sumptuous of the transatlantic boats."
However, there were other reasons that people were on board Titanic. Some passengers deliberately booked their passage on Titanic because of the pervasive positive news coverage. So, for instance, Lawrence Beasley, which you will hear his name so much, he had heard from his friends how much they had enjoyed traveling on the Olympic, and if the newspapers were to be believed, the Titanic would be even better. He booked his passage on Titanic partly because of all the press coverage, and partly because of the novelty on quote, being on board the largest ship yet launched. And then you have Jacques and May Futrelle. They had originally intended to sail on the Cunard Line's Mauretania, but May, quote, had heard that the turbines of those fast boats made a disagreeable vibration. So clearly the news coverage it's working. It's working out.
Yes.
So the Futrelles changed their mind and they booked passage on Titanic instead. May expressed nervousness to her husband about it being Titanic's maiden voyage. As she pointed out, quote, "This boat is new. She's never been tried out." Jacques reassured her by saying, quote, "Don't you ever worry about it. She'll never be so safe again as on this trip. They're out for a record in every way. Besides those big boats, they're practically unsinkable."
There you go. I mean, it was just, the mindset was there. So, anyway, and some passengers had purchased tickets for other ships, but their passengers were transferred to Titanic because of a coal strike in the United Kingdom. Now, I found this I'd never heard this, and so I found this very interesting, that the coal strike began in February of 1912, and it threw the United Kingdom into chaos. So, number one, coal was absolutely crucial during this time. It fueled ships, trains, factories, and was a primary source of heat in people's homes. So why would the coal strike affect the Titanic? Well, it was because the coal deliveries were slowing down. The White Star Line had to get creative to obtain enough coal for Titanic's maiden voyage.
Because can you imagine how much coal?
Oh my goodness!
I know I've read this statistic at some point. I will find it. But I mean, it was a whole process just to fill her coal bunkers.
I can only imagine the size of those. Anyway, yes, lots.
Well, because
of
if we're talking about 92 feet across, and that is at her widest point, but still, 92 feet plus or minus so much. And then there were, gosh, I'm trying to think. I want to say there's like 12 different coal bunkers. I will look that up too. And it goes all the way across the ship. And so they're having to fill it all the way across
That's
the 92 feet
coal.
by however many wide times however many coal bunkers.
Wow. Yeah, so it's because the deliveries are slowing down, the White Star Line had to get creative to obtain enough coal for the Titanic's maiden voyage. So they canceled upcoming voyages on some of their other smaller ships. So that way, and it laid them up. They laid them up at the port of Southampton. So they could then transfer the coal from those ships to Titanic, so that would give Titanic the coal she needed. So even during the strike. So, and then you had mentioned that some of the is there any of the transcripts from the inquiries that talk about people that came and the coal strike being a reason why they were on the ship? Or...
I just found her today. Her name's Elizabeth Nye.
Really?
I was reading through her stuff today, and she was one of the people that her passage was on a different ship. I don't recall which one it was, and it was canceled, and she went on Titanic instead.
Oh, it's just fascinating. I did not realize that that played a part. Mm-hmm. And then we'll also, well, anyway, okay.
So then some passengers were aboard Titanic purely by chance or timing. So like Margaret Brown that we had mentioned previously, which y'all may know her as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Her real name is Margaret Brown. So she was in Egypt, I believe. She was traveling with the Astors. She gets news that her grandson is very sick and she's got to come home immediately. So she basically just booked the first thing to get home, and it was Titanic. So, and then there was Eleanor Caspier.
I say Caspier.
And she said, "My being aboard Titanic was merely a matter of chance. I was visiting in Paris, and being desirous of coming to America, I took the first available steamer, which, as luck would have it, happened to be Titanic." And then, of course, as discussed in our previous episode, this is the time period from 1880 to 1920. There is a huge amount of immigration in which more than 20 million immigrants arrive in the United States.
Wow.
So you can imagine that these people, they have the money for their passage now. It's time to go. Maybe they did, ooh, yay, Titanic, let's go on that one. But for the most part, there is a good deal of just daily business of getting across the Atlantic.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so, the passengers, they may have come from different walks of life with different reasons for boarding Titanic, but it's easy to imagine the excitement they must have felt when that big day arrived. I can only imagine. I've never been on a cruise. I've seen the ships down in, what was that, San Diego. I've seen them there. I think it was Long Beach. Yes, there were cruise ships down there as well. So I remember just watching the people.
I mean, it is an experience.
Yeah.
I have been on one, and I'll tell you, best part was that you could get like French onion soup delivered to your stateroom at like 11 o'clock at night, because I'm a foodie, and it was the best.
Oh yeah, so I mean, I have to admit, I was looking at the boat and watching the people, thinking, "Wow, that looks really cool." So someday we'll see. So for the Titanic, the big day, Wednesday, April 10th, 1912 arrived. So that was there were 2 Titanic special boat trains from London. They arrived at the port of Southampton at the White Star Dock. So the earlier train arrived at 9:30 a.m. carrying second and third class passengers who began the earlier embarkation process. So the later train arrived at 11:30 carrying first class passengers, and the local newspaper reporter exclaimed, "I've never saw a passenger list that contains so many well-known names. It seems highly probable now that no ship ever began on an Atlantic crossing with so much wealth represented in her first cabin." So,
Daddy, how much would it cost to travel on Titanic?
Well, I found this surprising. I looked into it, and what I found was that if you were wealthy enough, they had what they call the first class suite, a first class berth, then you had second and third class. So the most expensive being the first class suite. So in 1912, it would have cost you $4,350 for a first class. This would be the suite. That's equivalent today's about $133,000.
Holy goodness!
And the other interesting thing is that the exchange rate over time has varied greatly between our countries. So at this time, I believe it was $5 to the pound. So American dollars to the pound. So it was it's changed. It's ebbed and flowed over the years. So now a first class berth, not a first class suite, would have been about $150 back then in 1912. Today's would be about $4,500.
Okay, that's more reasonable.
I mean, I've never cruised, but that sounds like pretty reasonable for today's rates.
Sounds
maybe.
fair.
Second class passenger back in 1912 would have paid $60, and today that's around $1,800. And then third class passenger back in 1912 would have been about $35 in American U.S. dollars.
Because you're talking about essentially a week. They're going to be on the ship for a week.
So, I mean, today's money, that's a little over $1,000. So a little over a week, $1,000 for third, $2,000 for second, $4,500 for like a first class. I mean, it doesn't sound too outrageous.
I mean, still.
But that first class suite at $133,000.
Well, because I read one thing that they would talk about the minimum first class minimum was this amount, and that's because there's like a gradations of, or gradations? Anyway, someone will correct me, of luxuriousness in the different staterooms. And so on one of the decks, they had the suite, and it had its own promenade deck. So there's 2 private promenade decks. You could only imagine how much that little layout would cost you.
Probably 130. Well,
Probably. Which, so funny, going back to the movie, that scene where Cal Hockley is confronting Rose about her going down and going to the third class party with Jack, and he flips the table over. They are in the private promenade deck.
oh, wow.
Yeah, if you take a look at that scene, that's what that is.
Okay. So then so between embarkation and sailing, Titanic was open for both passengers and guests to explore. So so before we go any further, let's discuss some nautical terminology. So I know this is something you and I have been just, I read something and I go, what does that mean? Oh, that's all right. So anyway, let's just talk.
Google's our friend.
Let's talk about this. So imagine you're on the ship and you're looking towards the front of the ship where Jack and Rose are flying at the very front. That is the bow. So if you're facing the bow, to your right would be starboard and to the left is port. And the easy way to remember that is that port and left both have 4 letters. So that's how I've always remembered
That's how I have to do it.
Yeah, so port, left, 4 letters. Starboard, a lot more than 4 letters.
Moss letters.
So that's right. And then, so if you turn around from the bow and you look at the other end of the ship, that's called the stern. So you have the bow, the stern, you got port, you got starboard. Now, these are the ones that you and I have had some difficulty with. So
It's interesting. So we're talking about forward and aft.
Yes.
So it doesn't seem to be a specific location, but if I'm standing, and then you've also got amidships. Amidships is what it kind of sounds like. It's just kind of like the middle of the ship. So if we're standing in a particular place, and if you look towards the bow, there's something in that direction, you would say that it is forward of you. And if there's something behind you, you would say it's aft of where you are. But obviously you as a person, your location changes. So then if I go to a different room, something that was aft could now be forward. You kind of see what I'm saying?
Right, so it's more of it's in reference to where you are.
Exactly.
That's what you're talking about. So if I'm standing here and if forward of me would be the bow and I want to go to the bow, then that would be forward.
That's forward.
And then if something is behind me, it would be aft. It's in relation to where I am.
If you're standing on the stern and you've got nothing but the rail behind you, everything is forward.
Yes, don't go aft.
Don't go aft. Don't do it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's interesting to me in the nautical terms, and then even reading through Lord's book, I know that, and I'll have to go back and remember the time frame. But there's even terminology that changed at specific years. One thing used to mean something, and then it's like when the Titanic turned. I'll have to go back.
Oh, it was the tiller?
Yes.
Yeah, because it wasn't like driving a car. It was like opposite.
Because they were going to the port, and they actually said something starboard. And I thought, why'd they do that? Well, it turns out terminology changed at a certain period of time.
Exactly.
So maritime, they just like to just keep people on their toes. So
it's an adventure.
Yes. So, Corey, you have a really good understanding of the layout of the ship, far better than you've done so much research on this. Would you please take us through our tour of the Titanic?
Absolutely. So, I have a visual aid in front of me. Dad has one as well. This same visual aid will be up on the website. So for those of you that have access to the internet, if you want to be taking a look while we're going through this, it may help clear up a couple things. I'm a very visual learner. So if you are looking at, and then before I get into that, as I read through the primary sources, you're going to hear the passengers refer to the decks by alphabetical designation, A, B, C, etc. However, there does appear to be some confusion and dispute about what letter belongs to what deck. And then even we were looking up images, and we were just trying to find one good image that was already highlighted and showed the different numbering, but it doesn't even seem to stay consistent.
They're all so different.
They're all so different. So the information I'm about to give you aligns with what the majority of historians use. So I'm confident in sharing it.
Okay.
So on the very top deck, this is the boat deck. It's also referred to as the top deck and sometimes the sun deck. Asterisk. Some other people claim that some deck is something else. I'm not going to get into it. It seems to be a very small amount of people. So that's got your lifeboat storage, which makes sense. It has the bridge, which is the navigating bridge and the wheelhouse. So that would be with, officers and the captain and the crew. It's also got the officers' quarters, the officers' promenade. It has the first-class gymnasium, which was a very new amenity. It was a first-class amenity. The boat deck is also referred to as the first-class open promenade and the second-class open promenade, which were separated by a rail. And so it's basically just a place up top for people to be outside in the sunshine. And then you have your first-class entrance. And this is what houses the grand staircase, which was solid oak. It's intricately carved. I'm sure you can picture the scene in the movie. It's topped by that wrought iron and white glass dome, which allowed in daylight during the day. And it was lit by electricity at night. So even when she was steaming by, it just would have been so beautiful.
That would have been very, very beautiful.
So, and also the first-class entrance, it's going to come into play on the night of the 14th, because this is the first class really only way to get up to the boat deck. So you're going to be picturing people funneling up through the first class entrance.
Okay.
So as passengers walked down the grand staircase from the boat deck, so you can imagine you're going on down, you're heading to the promenade deck, they would be passing that wood carving that represents honor and glory crowning time. And so getting to the promenade deck, this would be deck A. So, Dad, if you're looking at your picture, the very top one with the little boats that are hanging off, that's your boat deck. If you go down to the next row of windows, that on the right, they appear to be, almost like curved. And then over to the left, it's more just rectangular.
Right. Looks like it's open or something.
They are actually sliding windows.
Oh, cool.
Yes. So it is the first class promenade is an enclosed promenade for strolling or deck games. It's fitted with large windows that could slide down if the weather permitted, but you'll notice it's only in a certain point that those can actually be opened, and that's going to be really important again on the night that they're loading the lifeboats.
Okay.
So then you go down to, actually no, on the promenade deck, you also have some more of the first class amenities. You've got the first class lounge, the first class smoke room, the veranda and palm court cafes, and then moving down to the bridge deck, which is also B deck. So just go down one.
So we're down. This is our third deck now.
This is our third deck.
Third deck down.
We got boat, we got promenade,
Okay.
we got bridge. That's B. And the bridge deck had the a la carte first class restaurant. It had the Café Parisien that we had talked around before. And that's also where you get down into the very first second class amenity, which would be the second class smoking room. So I'm sure, as you can imagine on this kind of a boat, for the first class, you are talking wood paneling. I want to say that the first class smoking room had like mother of pearl inlay, fireplaces. The reading and writing room was meant to kind of be more like for ladies, during the day. So it was very feminine. It had rose-colored carpets, and it had big windows that overlooked the promenade, and it's all meant to just be very luxurious and sumptuous. And
I can imagine.
Oh my!
Man,
oh
sounds beautiful.
Goodness! So then, when you move down into second class, it's not quite as nice as I'm sure you can imagine.
I heard, but what Lord said, it was still better. It
Yes.
was more luxurious than other liners for second and third class.
So they still put in the effort. There's a lot more. There's in second class, you've got kind of more the oak paneling. You still have large windows. And one of the gentlemen who came aboard Titanic at Southampton to take a tour, he said that the public apartments of the second class were equal to those of many first class hotels in roominess and comfort.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like they really did go all out to make it an experience throughout for all the classes that were on the Titanic.
Yes. So then moving down to the next deck is the shelter deck, which is C, which is really the first deck that you can see extends all the way from what we would term like the stern to the bow.
Okay,
Everything else has been tiered,
Yes.
kind of up like a wedding cake. This is one of the larger decks. So the C deck or shelter deck had the second class library, the second class covered promenade, which was a really big deal. They don't normally get a covered promenade.
Wow.
And the third class smoke room. It also had the third class lounge and general room. Now, moving down from second into third, it's a lot more utilitarian. They don't have the comfy armchairs. They've got benches, and their windows are not large windows, they're portholes. And, but they still had their own designated area, which for them was very exciting.
That's important, yeah.
Yes. So now the thing that actually makes me laugh is that on the C deck, on the shelter deck, it's called the third class promenade. That's just a really kind way of saying that the third class passengers had access to the after well deck on C deck, or they could climb the stairs to the B deck and walk around the poop deck. Which if I knew you were going to giggle. If you look if you look at the stern of the boat,
yes.
So see where the black line ends. So that would be the after, where did that go? The after well deck is kind of down there.
Okay.
And then when you kind of come back up again at the very end of the stern where it rises back up and it's white, that would be your poop deck.
Interesting. I wonder why they call it that. That another nautical term. I mean, I've heard poop deck. Swab the poop deck.
Swab the poop deck. I'm not going to pretend to know that.
I don't know. That's something I have to look into. Why is it called the poop deck?
But I think it's so funny. Oh, the third class promenade. Let's be real. The after well deck is also where cargo hatches were. Yeah. That's where machinery was to lift things, to lower it through the decks. It's just open decking.
Yeah, you can see that crane, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
There's a good picture. I'm glad we'll have this up on our website so you guys can check this out. So.
Yes.
Cool. I like that.
So we're moving on down. So now we are at the first row of windows, portholes into the black part of the ship.
So we're going further down.
Further on down. Saloon deck. And so there's a first class area in D deck.
Four levels down, there's a first class?
Yes, there is. That's about the face I made. I was like, why?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Whoa. How did the second and the third end up on C if I'm confused? I just didn't think that.
I mean, I always
would
thought
happen.
that first class is going to be all the way at the top. It's going to be luxurious. The very top of the ship, all glass and open or something and fancy.
There's a reason for it. We'll get into it.
Okay.
So on the saloon deck, you have the first class reception area that leads into the first class dining saloon. You also have the second class dining room, and then when you go down to E, so we're going down a whole nother level.
Wow.
This is basically passenger accommodations. So this is where our vocab comes in. First class is going to be amidships.
So in the middle of the ship.
In the middle. So if we were to look and you kind of roughly divide that in thirds in your mind, like vertically, that section in the middle, that's going to be where your first class is.
So you're talking first class is like 5 decks down.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I never would have thought that.
Now, keep in mind, there are some on B and C. There's even a couple on A. But yes, there are first class would have been amidships on E. Second class would have been aft, so near the stern area.
Gotcha.
And third class would have been forward or near the bow. So then going down a whole nother level.
Wow.
We got
further.
The middle deck, which is F. And this had the third class dining room. It had what they call the swimming bath, which is an indoor swimming pool. It was a very new feature on Atlantic liners. It was filled with heated seawater and was very popular.
Oh, yeah. Kind of like a Flyshacker pool in San Francisco. That was also that was the largest saltwater pool I believe in the world. I'm not sure about that, but it was huge. The other day I swam in it. There was actually a boat race going on the other end.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Yeah. Down on the middle deck or F deck, it also had the Turkish bath. This was very cool, very chic. Cool. And then going down a whole nother level, you've got the lower deck, which is G deck, which had the squash court, which I'm thinking squash is kind of like pickleball.
Squash. I'm thinking, I'm not sure.
Some sort of a ball.
I've heard it. Yeah, I've heard of it. I've just never played it.
So then the lower 3 decks under G are the orlop deck, the lower orlop deck, and the tank top, which we're not even going to get into these decks because they were inaccessible to passengers. So there's no reason for passengers to be there. So just because we've talked about so much, we've got the boat deck. You've got promenade A, bridge B, shelter C, saloon D, upper E, middle F, lower G.
Wow.
Just
off the top of your head, that's pretty good.
You know actually how I remember this? Because boat as the boats, but I think about it as starting with promenade, please bring shoes and salsa. So that would, which is all I need.
There you go.
Promenade, bridge, shelter, saloon,
Oh,
and then you
okay.
get into upper, middle, lower.
Okay.
So that's how I remember it.
Very good. That's awesome.
Um,
But it just like we had talked before. I mean, I just assumed first class was going to be on the top.
mhm.
I was shocked that they're in the mid, but I understand that's the most stable. I
Yes.
can see that if you're in the middle of the ship, any kind of movement, you're going to feel much less
Yes.
than you would if you were on the sides. So
So I had assumed
or
that all
higher.
the first class public rooms, amenities, and staterooms would be on the upper levels of the ship. As it turns out, I'm not alone in thinking that. Historian Gareth Russell addresses this very common misconception by saying, quote, a common misconception about the allocation of space for the respective traveler classes was that the liner's architecture directly replicated the concept of social hierarchy, with first class occupying the top decks and third spread over the lowest. In reality, the most stable parts of the liner are amidships, since they are the least prone to pitching during inclement weather. This means the most stable and therefore the most desired locations on the ship were right in the middle, all the way down, from deck A to deck G. And this leads us to a crucial design feature of the Titanic, the companionways.
What is a companionway? I know what a companion is. Like you go on a trip, you have someone that hangs out with you and goes places. But what
I
is?
mean, I guess you could kind of think about it like that.
Yeah,
So a companionway on Titanic is used to describe staircases, hallways, corridors, basically any space through which a passenger got from one location to another.
Okay.
So Titanic was designed in such a way that a particular class's companionways would conveniently and deliberately lead to the accommodations and amenities intended for them. Conversely, it prevented them from accessing anything outside their designated areas. This made free travel between the decks impossible.
So they were directed where the White Star liner wanted the different classes to.
There was a flow. There's a logic and a flow. And this design will prove fatal the night of the collision as third class passengers attempt to access the first and second class decks where the lifeboats were being loaded, but right where they were not supposed to be.
Wow. So there definitely was a process of flow, like you said, to keep people going in certain classes going where they wanted them and where they didn't want them. So that's interesting. I know I think I'd read something about the companion where the companionway is also part of the boiler rooms and the engine rooms. Weren't there some companionways for the?
There is. There's one all the way down in the very, very bottom of the ship, and it leads. Oh gosh, what do they call it? I'll have to look up the name for it, but it actually takes the people out of the boiler rooms, engine rooms, down this kind of long hallway, if you will, to a particular, I don't want to call it a staircase, it's kind of more like a ladder system where the workers, the stokers, the engineers, etc., can then climb up and go to their cabins and never be seen by a passenger.
Oh yeah, that's what I'd read that. So yeah. So now, well, thank you for taking us through a tour of the Titanic, and we're going to get back to we're on track for the maiden voyage, taking off on its first maiden voyage. So, but before the Titanic set sail, the passengers and curious members of the public were free to come aboard and explore the ship in its entirety. So, a second-class passenger, Lawrence Beasley, said the decks and passageways were so extensive that it is no exaggeration to say that it is quite easy to lose one's way on such a ship. So, there was also a curious London citizen, so he wasn't a passenger, but he just came on board. His name is Ernest Townley, and so he spent a couple of hours aboard Titanic and gave a wonderfully descriptive account. So this is, quote, on board the Titanic, one felt as safe as if one were sitting in the Savoy or in the Cecil Hotel.
Savoy.
Savoy. Oh, okay. Sorry. With thousands of tons of concrete for foundations. She was so much larger than anyone ever even expected. She looked so solidly constructed as one knew she must be, and her interior arrangements and appointments were so palatial that one forgot now and then that she was a ship at all. So that's what we were talking about earlier. I can only imagine that what they saw with their eyes and what they experienced around them made them forget they're even on a ship.
There's a lot of people that make the comment that you forget there's so little vibration, there's so little movement, and she's so large, especially if you're not looking at the ocean. I can imagine very well that you could forget you're on a ship.
Yeah. So to finish Ernest Townley's quote, the cabins of the first class were not cabins, but rooms furnished in lavish richness. There were Marie Antoinette bedrooms with lovely old-fashioned English four-poster wooden bedsteads, with old rose canopies and valances. There were family suites with beautiful sitting rooms and servants' quarters. So that must have been quite a day to have, family, friends, all of that, the hype.
Oh, yeah.
The trains came, people loaded, and just getting all set
And
for this
all
adventure.
of the news reporters
Yep.
and the people that are just coming to see her. They've been reading about her for years at this point in the newspaper.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, while the first and second class passengers, as well as the curious members of the public, were taking in the wonders of Titanic, the third class passengers were experiencing a very different boarding process. As we stated previously, the earlier train from London had arrived at 9:30, and with it came the second and third class passengers. The earlier arrival time was necessary due to the lengthy boarding process for third class passengers, many of whom were traveling in family groups with young children. And again,
Oh.
anybody with kids doesn't need any further explanation.
No, you don't.
No, but since the White Star Line was carrying immigrants into the United States, the company was required to adhere to America's very strict immigration policies. This included a medical examination for all third-class passengers at the time of embarkation. If they passed the medical inspection, the third-class passengers were then required to be quarantined away from first and second-class passengers for the entirety of the voyage.
Entirety of the voyage?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So if a third-class passenger came into contact with a first or second-class passenger, all exposed persons had to undergo another medical examination before they were allowed to set foot on American soil.
Thus the companionways.
Yes, keeping them very separate.
Yes, I can see why they were set the ship up that way. So
Yes.
that makes sense.
It was definitely for a purpose.
Yes.
And then although it was common practice at the time to refer to immigrants collectively as, quote, steerage, historian Gareth Russell has noted that the term doesn't really fit those that traveled third class on Titanic. So are you ready for another vocab word?
Oh, another word? Yes.
I know you get two.
Yes.
Etymology.
Oh, wow. Isn't that where you study bugs, the study of bugs?
No.
No?
No, that's an entomologist.
Well, that's pretty darn close.
Okay, well, fair enough. But etymology, the study of the origin of words and the way that their meanings have changed throughout history. So,
okay.
The origin of the noun steerage comes from the period of mass migration to the United States, which we briefly touched on last episode. Steerage is defined as a section of inferior accommodations in a passenger ship for those paying the lowest fare. The original location of said accommodations were near the rudder, which steers the ship, thus steerage.
That's cool. Well, that's where etymology comes in.
It's all coming together.
Yeah, with our
Historiography.
historiography. We use them both in a sentence.
There you go. So to qualify as true steerage, a ship had to have communal dormitories, and these were not even offered on the Titanic. Every third-class passenger had a bed located in a cabin. They were bunk beds located in smaller cabins shared with others of the same gender, but it was still a room with a door. And the White Star Line offered the very best third-class passenger accommodations, which meant that the third-class tickets on Titanic or Olympic cost as much as second-class tickets on other liners.
Wow. That must have been really something for second and third class passengers to experience.
It must have been a real treat for them.
Oh yes, that must have been awesome. So we are now we're to the point where we're preparing to depart from Southampton. So at 11:45, the bell rang, warning all non-passengers to disembark. And just before the last gangway was withdrawn, a group of stokers ran up to the ship, clearly intending to board. However, they were stopped and turned away by an officer who was clearly not impressed by their excuse for being late. And is this Lawrence Beasley?
It is Lawrence Beasley.
Lawrence Beasley, he stated, quote, those stokers must be thankful men today that some circumstance, whether their own lack of punctuality or some unforeseen delay over which they had no control, prevented their being in time to run up that last gangway. They will have told, and will no doubt tell for years, the story of how their lives were probably saved by being too late to join the Titanic.
Can you imagine?
I cannot even imagine.
That's going to get someone buying you a drink at a bar.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just saying.
So the gangways were pulled in, the hatches closed, the Titanic was ready to depart Southampton on the first leg of her maiden voyage.
So it is noon. It required a small fleet of tugboats to help ease Titanic away from the pier and into the main channel. This was a delicate operation because the tide was so low that there was very little room between Titanic's hull and the bottom of the river. The liner was safely guided to the deep water channel. The command was given for the engines to be engaged at slow ahead. But as the triple screw propellers began to revolve, they created a very powerful suction, the force of which pulled the American liner, which is called the New York, from her berth towards Titanic until her mooring lines snapped.
Wow, now that you talk about you talked about the
You've seen the size of those ropes.
yes, those are huge ropes, and that the suction that is created by the movement of the water as Titanic went through, it drew that New York so to the point where it snapped those.
Those ropes look like they're bigger than a man's arm.
I mean, you talk about a force and a power and a force that's there. I mean, that's amazing.
Beasley described the noise of those snapping ropes as, quote, a series of reports like those of a revolver, with the snaky coils of thick rope flung themselves high in the air and fell backwards among the crowd, which retreated in alarm. And then, to our amazement, the New York crept towards us slowly and stealthily, as if drawn by some invisible force which she was powerless to withstand.
Oh, could you imagine? I mean, it's coming your way.
There's so Jacques and May Futrelle, they're up on the deck at this time, and they're holding on to they're just standing there, and Jacques tells May, hold on for the impact.
Wow.
You know, as they're watching this come, and they haven't even moved. It's been all of probably 4 minutes.
Oh yeah.
But there is a hero of this tale. It's the
right.
crew of the Vulcan, which is one of the little tugboats that had helped ease Titanic away from the dock. The crew of the Vulcan managed to attach lines to the New York and pull her away from Titanic without the two ever having collided.
Amazing.
The
awesome.
captain of the Vulcan would later swear that at one point there was only 4 feet separating the hulls of the two ships.
Wow.
And one of the crew, Titanic's saloon steward John Butterworth, said that the two ships were so close he could have tossed a penny onto the New York's deck from where he was standing on Titanic.
You can only imagine what the people on the bridge of the Titanic and the New York,
Everyone
what they must have been thinking. What in the world?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
No damage was done to either vessel because they didn't collide, but the incident did delay Titanic's departure by almost an hour because they had to get New York back to the berth.
Oh, yeah.
Like it was a whole process.
Yeah. So now that we've launched and the New York almost hit us. So what is the next? So now that we've left Southampton, where's the next port for Titanic?
We're going to head over to Cherbourg Harbor, which is on the coast of France. So 4 to 5 o'clock, the boat train from Paris had arrived at Cherbourg Harbor. Unfortunately, the excited passengers then learned of Titanic's delay leaving the port of Southampton. One of the passengers getting on at Cherbourg is Margaret Brown, unsinkable Molly Brown. She says this, quote, when we arrived, no steamer in sight. She was late, having met with some difficulty in leaving the docks. We all boarded the tender that was waiting to convey the hundreds of passengers to the master palace of the sea that proved later to be the tomb of many of them.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of, you're all excited and you're there and it's like, ship's not here.
They apparently, when they say they boarded the tender, so they were not on land. They had to get onto a boat that was going to take them out to Titanic.
Oh, okay.
So they're sitting on this little boat waiting.
Oh, wow.
And apparently it was very gray and drizzly and wet and just miserable.
Terrible.
So 6:30 to 7 o'clock, Titanic arrives in Cherbourg, France, for the passenger embarkation. Those that embarked on Titanic out of Cherbourg were some of the most prestigious names on the first-class passenger roster, and the reason the Titanic's crossing had been nicknamed the Millionaire Special in the press. Some of the notable passengers that got on out of Cherbourg were John Jacob Astor and his new bride, Madeline. If I could speak, new bride, Madeline. I think it's Benjamin Guggenheim. Does that sound familiar?
I'm not sure.
And then Mrs. Margaret Brown. There's also Mr. and Mrs. John Thayer and their eldest son, Jack, which we will be hearing from Jack quite a bit.
Yes, we will.
There was Edith Rosenbaum, who was an American fashion journalist. She gave this quote. She said, in the dusk, her decks were 11 tiers of glittering electric lights. She was less a ship than a floating city. Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor were standing near me at the rail. The colonel pointed out some of the vital statistics of the mammoth ocean liner. She's unsinkable, Colonel Astor said, a modern shipbuilding miracle.
Wow. Oh yeah, there was some money on that ship, no doubt about it. So, and then 8:10 to 9 p.m., Titanic departs Cherbourg for Queenstown, Ireland. And then on Thursday, April 11th, 1912, from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., Titanic arrives in Queenstown, Ireland for passenger embarkation. And then at 1:30 to 2 p.m., the Titanic departs Queenstown, Ireland, departs for New York with approximately 2,200 souls on board.
And the reason that there's the time estimation is because, again, going back to our non-disputable timeline, there are so many different times that they talk about things that happened. And so this historian will say this, that historian will say that, this account will say this, and it just seems safer in the interest of transparency to give you guys the time range. And then depending if there's a particular historian you favor, you go with theirs.
Okay. Well, now that we have embarked on the maiden voyage, we're now going to be then looking forward. We're going to be next looking at the passengers.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
So now here's really where we're going to be getting into the meat and potatoes. This episode, the previous episode, this was all context. This was setting the scene and kind of giving you guys a feeling for the world in which these people lived. But now, as we move forward, what we're going to be talking about is the experience of Titanic in the words of the passengers. There's going to be discussion between Dad and I, after we read a section, maybe we'll be like, okay, well, hold on a second. Let's talk about that. Or let's compare these two. But really the shining star as we move forward is going to be the words, the feelings, the fears, the hopes of those people on Titanic as she spent these days at sea.
At the word, and this will be from them, from their own words.
No editorializing from me. Now, there are, obviously with all things, and this was all typed out by me. So obviously, if you've got a very long paragraph and there's parts of it, I may have, grabbed this bit from the beginning and that bit from the end, but it is within the context of what the person had to say. It's just kind of cleaning it up so that you guys are not sitting here through 50 episodes to talk through everything.
Well, I have to admit, we had so many notes for this one. I didn't think it was going to be one episode, but
What's our time right now?
We're at a minute 7 right now.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
I was a minute.
Hour 7 minutes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And that is our goals. We really wanted to stay between 45 minutes to an hour. We didn't want it to go much longer, but no, the next time that we all get together, we are going to be hearing it from exactly what they saw, and I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So, and I want to thank those of you who sent your comments and any feedback that we've received from you. I really appreciate that. We are in the process of getting. We've had some technical difficulties, so if you didn't see responses, I apologize for that. We apologize for that. We're getting. I'm learning. So,
it's a learning process.
It is a learning process, but the most direct way that it will be pretty surefire is if you send us an email. And the email address is theprimaryNerdPodcast@gmail.com. That comes directly to me. Technology will not mess that up, but the website's a different story. And our website is theprimarynerd.com. You can leave comments there, and they will be directed to the email. So either one I will be able to see, but
there seems to be a lag.
There are some things. There were just some reply things that I knew nothing about, and it didn't work out very well. But we're getting the hang of it.
Yeah.
So,
then with the website, that is going to be where we have the image of the ship. That way you could be taking a look at that. And that ship, we're going to be referencing it throughout every episode. It's just going to be help to kind of solidify where we are. It's also going to have the sources. All sources will be listed there. And as I had said, I believe in the methodology episode, if you have any questions where exactly I found a quote in particular, please feel free to reach out. Send us an email and ask and say, hey, where did that testimony come from? I am more than happy to share. And
we will respond to every email. So like I said, email or comment through the website, which will, in essence, come to the email as well. Yes. So that is the most direct way. So I've learned so much from all this
Oh man,
research. This is
we
awesome.
have not even.
That's
we,
great.
we are getting into the good stuff now.
Okay. Well, then with that, we need to sign off. So
I'm Courtney,
I'm Brian.
and this is the Primary Nerd.